Hello and welcome to the Talley Talk podcast. Before we begin, I'd like to tell you a little bit about Talley. We're a mental wellness startup specialising in anonymous group conversations called Talley Talks. Our weekly Talley Talks provide our members with a safe space to speak and listen in a discreet setting. This podcast will give listeners a feel for our weekly conversations while being anonymous. For this podcast, all participants have agreed to the recording while keeping their identity confidential. What you are about to listen to can be found sensitive and distressing. Please be advised to read the podcast description and respect the confidentiality and anonymity of the conversation. If you would like to attend a Talley Talk, please visit www.talleyapp.com and click Join a Talley Talk. Or if you would like to take part in the podcast, get in touch at hello@tallytalk.com. All links can be found in the bio. Thank you and enjoy.
Welcome to the Talley Talk podcast, everyone. Today we'll be discussing eating disorders, and we have our host MICHELINE on the line with us. But before we get into the conversation, I'd like everyone to do a one-word check-in. So during Talley Talks, we always do a one-word check-in because it's a great way to gauge how everyone's feeling. So in one word, what would sum up how you're feeling today or how you're feeling right now in this moment? And my one-word check-in is inquisitive.
I'm feeling excited.
Great. And what was your name? Sorry.
It's MICHELINE.
MICHELINE. Great. Anyone else in one word? What sums up how you're feeling right now?
I'm very anxious.
Anxious. Interesting. Anyone else? Feel free to unmute and just jump in.
I'm feeling honest.
Honest. Okay.
Quite tired and
Tired.
Quite chilled.
And chilled. Okay. Honest, tired, chilled, and excited. Okay, that's really good. So I'd like to introduce our host, MICHELINE, who you've all met just now. And MICHELINE, I'd like to hand over to you to take it away.
Okay, nice to be with you all for this podcast. This topic, eating disorders, which was first discussed in a Talley Talk a couple of months ago, well, I feel it's a really important topic, a subject that touches all sectors of society. Most of us may have heard of eating disorders like anorexia, bulimia, binge eating, even if we haven't experienced them. But there are many other forms of disordered eating. It will be really interesting to find out some more about them and people's experiences and journeys with them, or supporting loved ones who have been working through them. So I'd like to first of all introduce our co-host today, going by the name of Candle. Can I hand over to you, Candle, to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thank you. I'm 28 years old, and 2 years ago I was discharged from a specialist eating disorder unit where I was being treated for anorexia, and that was the only time I've been hospitalised for it. I have struggled with various forms of eating disorder really throughout my adult life, and restrictive anorexia only being one type of problem that I've had. I very much think of myself as being in recovery, if not recovered at this point, because I don't feel that enough of our conversation about it is about that particular subject. I think a lot of us know a lot about the kind of horrors of it when it's very, very serious. But what we don't necessarily know so much about is how do you get through that and come back to life.
Hi, Candle. Yeah, that was amazing. I think it was just fading in a bit. But I'm not the most knowledgeable on eating disorders. And I was wondering if anyone from their perspective could define what an eating disorder is, just in their own words. It doesn't have to be from a dictionary or anything.
I could have a go at that. It's PAELLA speaking. I couldn't give like a dictionary definition, and I can only, I suppose, when you're speaking about an eating disorder, you can only ever speak from your personal experience of it. And what I would describe an eating disorder as is the world is against you. Everything and everybody is going against what your own reality. And I'd also call it no way out. and hell. Yeah, not to sound too depressing or anything. There you go.
No,
That probably isn't the dictionary definition of it.
No.
I can define it in terms of what it's not, because the dietitian in the hospital was always insisting upon something called normal eating, and our eating disordered behaviour was distinctly not normal eating. Normal eating was quite prescriptively defined. It was a certain number of meals per day with a certain proportion of different nutrients in each of them, and the representation of all the different food groups. And I would be surprised if anybody ate as quote unquote normally. But I think by the idea of normal eating really comes down to the fact that food is not an obsession. It's not something that demands most of your mental resources throughout the waking day. You don't wake up concerned about what you're going to have for breakfast, and then as soon as that's over, immediately start worrying about lunch.
Okay, that explains a lot, Candle. It would be interesting to hear from anybody. How important has it been to discover or identify the causes for your eating disorders and the reasons behind them? Maybe you've had therapy or treatments which might have helped you understand where your disorders began.
There's a really heavy focus when you go into hospital or you have psychological treatment, a huge focus on finding a root cause. And you're often asked to fill in things called your mental health timeline, which tries to, dig up all of the significant things in your life which have triggered either depression or anxiety or things like that. A huge problem for me was that despite all of this kind of cognitive treatment, I was still never able to find a root cause. And that has been a huge kind of hindrance in my recovery, because the whole focus was to find why. And for me, it was almost impossible to get better because everybody was trying to find out the why instead of focusing on the present.
Yeah, I can see how that would be very, very frustrating for you. So it would be interesting to hear what has worked for you, apart from the cognitive route, trying to find out about the origins. Less time was spent on the here and now and what was going on. What has actually helped you?
Something that helped me was actually going into the eating disorders ward, and this is going to sound awful for some eating disorders sufferers, but I lost weight in hospital by eating, as Zoe described, normally. But it's not a helpful way of thinking at all, but it is my truth. And by having three meals and 2 or 3 snacks a day, even including things that were absolutely banned from my life, like crisps and cake and things, because I'd been suffering from bulimia and binge purge type bulimia, I'd completely messed with my metabolism and all sorts of other, potassium levels and all sorts of things. So my weight was fluctuating heavily. So it made me realise that actually eating regularly and eating a balanced diet with cheat foods, I was able to lose some weight. And it kind of made me realise what the body, how much a body can take and what my body really needs and deserves.
Wow, that's fascinating to think that journey and time spent on the ward actually brought you to those realizations.
Yeah.
It's Tulip here. I'm Candle's mum, so I've probably got a rather different perspective on things than, people who are suffering from this. But one thing I want to point out is when people are very ill with eating disorders, and really there is no logic to the behaviour. It is a delusional state. There's no doubt about it. And the brain requires calories to function normally. So a brain that's not receiving normal calories and has been chronically starved of that for a long time does not work normally. And so in some ways, when people are desperately ill and very underweight, as Candle was when she first went into hospital, you just have to somehow or other get those calories in, although it's a terrible thing to do and seems very cruel at the time, just in order to normalise and get some modicum of sensible thinking going. And you have to do that before any kind of psychological therapy takes place, really. You just have to correct the metabolic problems, the effects, the severe effects of starvation before you can even start.
Yeah. Before I was admitted to the specialist unit, I was on an endocrine unit in General Hospital for 2 months, just so that it could stabilize my metabolism. And one of the very cruel things is that the body, when you start refeeding somebody who's very, very underweight, the body restores itself much quicker than the mind. So the anorexic mind becomes trapped in what to them is like a grossly overweight body, but which is of course just a normal, healthy weight. And it takes much longer for the mind to recover. And then the thing that takes longest of all to recover is all of the social relationships which are destroyed by the illness.
It's a very, very selfish condition. It's all consuming, and you have to have immense patience to keep kind of relationships going, to maintain support and, that sort of loving care that the person really needs. Because in the real throes of the illness, that person is not the person you recognise as, your loved one. The behaviour, it's a delusional condition, that's all I can say. And anorexia is very selfish. It just wants to feed itself and to the exclusion of everything else. And so it needs patience. And
in my case, that meant months and years of enforcing a diet plan, which made sure I was getting exactly what my body needed all of the time, no ifs, no buts, so that habit becomes enforced.
it's not just a habit either, because you do get physiological changes in the way that appetite and satiation is registered in the brain, which goes completely awry. You don't know when you feel full and you don't know when you feel hungry. And so you have to almost eat by rote, not in the way that normal people do. And that takes time, but gradually, things start to get restored and back into balance again. Although I'm not naive enough to know that this isn't, for some people, a lifelong struggle, and people are in and out of better states and worse states, and setbacks are common, very common.
I would say, upon reflection, being in hospital gave me a lot more resources than I would have admitted it gave me at the time. I was really resentful of being there initially, and I also didn't feel as ill as everybody else, which was a huge problem for me because I found my disorder was binge type bulimia, as I said, and other patients were predominantly anorexic with signs of other eating disorders as well. So I felt a bit misunderstood there sometimes. But a huge thing for me was learning about the cycle of change. Some people will end up back in hospital time and time again. But learning the cycle of change for me was really important for me to not go back into hospital and understand what the difference between a lapse and a relapse is, and why not to panic and feel like you've undone all of your work if you have a lapse. And in my road to recovery, I've lapsed and relapsed, but the space between the lapses has diminished gradually. And I would also now say I'm kind of, I wouldn't say fully recovered, but I would say I've recovered now.
Hi, Paella. Sorry, Oxygen here. I just wanted to ask, what is the difference between lapse and relapse, if you don't mind?
Sure. So a good metaphor was a lapse is when you burst one of the tyres on the car, and that can be repaired quite quickly. A relapse is where you burst one by accident. So on purpose, you go with a big needle or nail or whatever, and you burst all of them on purpose because you've just completely self-sabotaged, and you think you've just messed up completely. And you're actually kind of determined that you're a failure and that there's no point to actually try to recover because you're that much of a failure. Whereas a lapse it's just a dip in the road.
Oxygen here. That was an amazing analogy.
Oh, thank you. I wish I could claim it as my own, but it wasn't.
I think the key is self-forgiveness. If you lapse, you have to be able to forgive yourself rather than to sabotage yourself. You describe a period of lapse and relapse after treatment, and the same thing happened to me, and I very nearly ended up going back into hospital again. And the thing that saved me was discovering that kind of self-forgiveness and self-compassion, and that I think is so fundamental to all of this is discovering that compassion for yourself, because every single eating disorder patient that I've ever met has been much, much better at loving other people than they have been at loving themselves. And there's, in that environment, there was so much in the environment of the hospital. There was so much love, but none of it was directed at no one directed it at themselves. It was all expressed towards each other.
Also, as well as self-compassion, I think distraction, finding not just a distraction because people are telling you to find something to do, but find a distraction that really fits you. So mine was writing. That really got me through and still gets me through. I don't know about yours, Candle. Did you find a distraction?
Yeah, I have, and to some extent, they've been the distraction has been a way of working through things, but also to some extent, it's just a replacement for it in terms of just the sheer amount of mental space that the eating disorder takes up. I was thinking about the eating disorder the other day in terms of like the way that ice can destroy rocks by getting into the cracks, and then it freezes and expands and shatters everything. And then all you're left with is the ice. And it's like, if you've got cracks in your life where you're not sure about your identity, or you feel that you're lacking control in some way, or there's some lack of meaning or purpose, or whatever it may be, where there is a crack in your life, the anorexia or the bulimia or whatever it is, it gets in there and it expands and it breaks everything else apart and takes over, and it is so jealous and it doesn't let you have anything else. And I've got diary entries, where I talk about this. So I've never had the issue about trying to figure out what the cause was. I know perfectly well what the cause was. It's because everything else disintegrated in anorexia to perva. And the part of the point of the distraction is it's rebuilding the rest of your life so that you do know who you are again. You have got something else to do and to think about. You have got some purpose beyond calorie counting or being sick or whatever disordered behavior it is that used to give you meaning.
Those analogies are just so powerful. The analogy of the ice getting into cracks, it just seems to convey it all so skillfully, so beautifully. I get the sense that these various eating disorders involve such harshness to the sufferer, quite unrelenting, and learning to accept love from those around you, as you sound like you have in the hospital environment, then hopefully learning from that to give yourself that love, it sounds like such an important journey. But I can hear from you all that it's been such a long, long journey. It's very long and it requires a lot of patience, as I heard somebody say earlier.
It's important to feel understood, which is what being on an eating disorders helps with, but not necessarily by the staff. I never felt like staff understood. I felt like the understanding came through speaking with other patients, because actually it doesn't matter how much of a professional you are or a dietitian, they're looking at it from a bird's eye view still. So yeah, I think a lot of eating disorder patients do end up going into trying to give back once they've recovered. I suppose this is why I wanted to take part in this podcast, is because it's also kind of channeling your experience into something positive, which may be able to help others in the future. I also had exercise bulimia initially, and I then my binges began to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And exercise bulimia for me didn't cut the mustard anymore. It then got to the point where I was eating up to 30,000 calories in one sitting. And there was times where I felt like my eyes, I'm sorry, this is quite graphic, but I felt like my eyes were going to pop out of their sockets. Like my head would explode from the pounding of overeating. I'd collapsed a few times because I'd overate. And it got so ridiculous that I then did turn to purge bulimia. But do you mind if I say something about the identity aspect? I struggled with it a lot because I knew that I'd got binge eating disorder, and I desperately, desperately wanted to stop it, because if I wanted any disorder, I wanted to be anorexic because I wanted thinness. So I didn't want to have binge eating disorder, but that's what I'd got. So that was a real issue for me. And because I exercised a lot, and luckily I realise it now, I'm actually quite a slight person. I had no idea that I was back then. People didn't care. I would tell them that I'd binged, and they didn't care. They didn't believe me. There was no reaction other than, oh, it's fine. I had 2 portions of chili the other night, or I ate a whole packet of biscuits while I was watching TV. And I couldn't get it through to them without sounding angry that is not binge eating disorder. What you're doing is having a pig out sometimes. And then the identification thing was tough, because I just didn't feel like anybody was taking me seriously. And I think part of not being able to identify as it led to it getting worse and worse and worse in a lot of respects.
Hi, FERN here. I know I've been quite quiet throughout the podcast. So I think for me, I identified my disorder before anyone else did. For me, my eating disorder was more about the control I had. It gave me a sense of power and accomplishment, where everything else around me was sort of outside of my control. I was able to control how much I ate and how much weight I lost, how my body was looking. And I felt like, I don't know, I got a sense of power out of my eating disorder. And I guess I sort of realized I was on a very self-destructive path when I looked again and I dropped about 30 kilos.
So it sounds as though when you're going through these difficulties, it's important for those around you to really listen to you, to really acknowledge what you're saying, because I think it sounds like people are just looking at you superficially and saying, oh, you look fine, and not really caring about the fact that you are not experiencing well-being. You are experiencing suffering. You're experiencing distress.
So my eating disorder started when I was about 15. I'm now 31. And I'd love to tell people that I am recovered. In a sense, I am recovered in that I don't purge and I still have 1 or 2 days a year where I binge eat. But I would love to say that the self-loathing is gone, or the issue with control is gone, or my issue with food is gone, but it's not. It's just sort of something I've learned to cope with and sort of channel my need for control in finding out, like Paella said, how she found out what her body needs and what she needs to do to have a healthy body. I found that out, and that's sort of where I channel my control now. Is I need to eat this many calories, I need to balance my protein, fats and carbs, and I need to get the amount I need. I used to binge eat, and then I used to strap on a heart rate monitor, and then I would go run for kilometers to go run off everything I ate, because I wasn't able to make myself bring up or purge. So that's how I would do it. So I had exercise bulimia. So yeah, I would restrict how much I ate, and then if I did eat, I would go run it off.
Yeah, there were parts where I looked very well, actually. If I look back, my skin's great because all I ate was the absolute, superfoods. I never strayed anywhere away from a superfood at some points. So obviously my skin was great. I was running up to, probably about a marathon a week, but in dribs and drabs. Swimming every day, cycling every day, making sure that I was doing 100 sit-ups before I went to bed. Every time I was stood still, I was moving, So, yeah.
My experience is the opposite to yours, in almost every single way. I looked awful. And yes, I was telling everybody I was fine because I was lying to people because I didn't want them to interfere with me. And I found that, the diagnosis and identifying the diagnosis came very readily, and I loved it. It suddenly told me who I was. And I was extremely proud of what I'd done to myself, and I wanted everybody to see what I'd done to myself. And I became a gratuitous exhibitionist. Suddenly this whole the collapse of control which I felt over my sense of self was answered. I was an anorexic, and an incredibly important part of the recovery process for anybody who's been dealing with it for any length of time is to rebuild a healthy identity where the eating disorder is preferably not a part of the identity at all. But if it has to be a part of the identity, it's only a small part, and it doesn't supersede everything else that makes you a human being and life worth living. It's very, very fascinating to compare experiences because they are the opposite of each other in so many respects.
Hi, Oxygen here. That's really interesting, Candle. And I kind of had a question for Tulip, Candle's mum, just because I know you were kind of looking at it from an external point of view, being that Candle was your son. And how do you even, number one, identify that, but help someone in that state without being too forceful? Because I know earlier you referred to kind of really just having to get the calories into someone who's experiencing that.
Well, when somebody with an eating disorder is very, very ill, you have to try and seek professional help. It's not something that you can do as a parent at that point. And it's very difficult, actually, to get timely professional help. You can hear from people's experiences of often these conditions have gone on for a long time, and it's very important that people are believed. And also, the other thing is it's a secretive condition. People hide this condition. They don't actually, they're ashamed in some ways, or as Candle said, they don't want to be interfered with. And so it's hidden. And so you do have to get professional help. But once that initial, serious medical intervention is taking place, then it's very difficult because, it's a matter of being patient, of trying to learn to listen rather than to, as a parent, you're very, very anxious, obviously, about your loved one, or you're desperate for things to change. And I suppose you have to learn to be calm yourself. You have to learn to try and provide something in the life of the person that you care for that's not to do with the eating disorder. To have times that you can share that are to do with, doing things that are mutually enjoyable, that are away from food or thinking about food, to try and just get that little chink of something different to start to rebuild. You need to try and maintain trust, which is a really quite difficult thing, because to be very clear about what your expectations are, but those expectations need to be kind of realistic and achievable. And then you just need to sort of stick at them, really. And it's a difficult, but it's a hard thing. And then encouragement, when you see signs of improvement, to, encourage that and to comment on it and to find other, when somebody's personality and sense of well-being is so reduced, to try and find ways of helping to build that again. Because aside from the eating disorder, I think to be obsessed by food, to be watching every move, to be anxious about every relapse is very unhelpful, but does not come naturally. The natural thing is to be concerned, obviously. So it's a tough one. But one of the things I can say is that there are people that can help, even families, family therapies, and there are charities like MEET. Where we are in Yorkshire, there's a charity called SAIDA, which is the South Yorkshire Eating Disorders Association. And they ran a course which was called Treading on Eggshells, for families who had loved ones with eating disorders of various types. And it was a very, very helpful course in both understanding the disorders and also in understanding your own personality and ways of coping with difficulties that could be both helpful and unhelpful. And that was a really good thing to have gone to, I think. I found that very helpful. It's just when you have somebody who has a mental health disorder, which this is, to some extent, when it's in the severe throes of it, it definitely is. It causes a lot of anxiety and stress on families. And sometimes that anxiety and stress leads you to behave in ways which is not helpful for the person who has that difficulty. And so these courses help you recognize that and understand that, and really does calm things down a lot. But I think one of the most helpful things I think that we did was that we spent time together, away from food, away from eating, doing things that we both enjoyed.
It always does, though. I mean, if you're following a diet plan which insists you eat pretty much like every hour and a half or 2 hours, it's always going to come in. It's always going to be a factor.
Sure. I'm hearing that the amount of thought going into how you interact with a family member who is going through an eating disorder, it just takes so much love and so much ongoing support, and thinking how you're impacting on each other. It sounds really transformative for all of you. I can't see how any family member where there's an eating disorder in the family can remain untouched and untransformed by the whole process, which will go on for several years.
Well, one of the things that Candle taught me, which was quite useful, was you have, I I have a sense of control. I'm quite a controlling person. I realise that. And Candle said to me, there's some things that you can change, and you need to strive to be able to change those and think about how you can do that sensitively. But there are some things that you just can't change, and you have to learn to live with it. And that was quite a helpful comment, really.
I've had, in terms of control, I've realised that because my health is on the mend and on the rise, it's actually having a negative impact on relationships with partners I have, because it's a sense of, well, I've worked so hard on my own recovery, to have a partner who isn't looking after themselves. I've started becoming controlling towards their health. I know this is quite maybe oversharing or honest, but I just thought I'd bring that up because it's been playing on my mind a lot about how I'm starting to channel control from myself onto somebody else.
Yeah, it's double-edged, isn't it? Because on the one hand, having been through the ringer gives you so much empathy for other people's vulnerabilities. But then you go through it, why shouldn't they be able to as well?
Yeah. But they're not asking for your help, are they? They're not, and they're not disordered either. They just have their ways, their habits, and for somebody else to start interfering with them can be disastrous.
I think that's a really important point, to distinguish between what's just any kind of disorder. Everybody has different preferences and things that they're fussy about, and little food rituals, and there are some fad diets which, by some definition, would qualify as an eating disorder, but we're not sectioning those people and locking them up in secure psychiatric units.
I have a friend at work who eats one meal a day after a 10-hour shift of really heavy lifting and manual labour. And he eats his one meal a day in the evening after all of that. And it's quite remarkable. But that's not disordered eating. It's really important that people who aren't aware of eating disorders know the difference between, is that person deeply suffering, or are they just doing what they do?
All the men at my job do that dual stuff, which just reminds me of the medical nutritional drinks that we had to have in hospital when we refused to eat solid food.
Oh, Huel! Oh, that's disgusting. I used to have that.
It's just like 40 sip in a nicer bottle.
I'd just like to take a moment here, as we're halfway through, to tell you a little bit about our sponsors. We're brought to you by Claudia Armani Health Coach from The Healthy Gourmet. Claudia is an award-winning health coach with work featuring Vogue Japan and nominated in the UK Top 10 Health Coach blogs in both 2018 and 2019. Claudia has been generous enough to offer a 25% discount on all health coaching prices. All you have to do is quote Talley Talk, I repeat, Talley Talk, during the sign-up process at thehealthygourmet.co.uk to receive the 25% discount. Claudia will work with you to achieve the healthiest and happiest version of you in order to live life to the full. We are also brought to you by Crystal Yoga. Crystal is a qualified yoga instructor with years of experience in one-to-one, group and online classes specialising in vinyasa, hatha and restorative yoga. See for yourself and take part in Talley's Instagram Live class with Crystal on Sundays at 9 a.m, exclusively on the Talley Instagram profile.
Yeah, I know a lot of people who had Huel where I used to work as well, and they actually liked it, but I never tried it, but I just
They're
didn't
pretending.
That would not be, the dietitian would not regard that as normal eating by any stretch.
No.
It sounds intriguing. What is this Huel?
Huel is a vegan protein shake.
Right.
And it's apparently completely nutritionally balanced in every sense of the word. So it's got a little bit of everything in it.
Okay.
Yeah, oxygen here. It basically replaces like whenever I used to see people drink it, they basically would go through the day not eating an actual meal, and they just have fuel. And I guess for them, their excuse was it's kind of just quicker to have instead of making a meal or having to take time to eat, and you can have it on the go and stuff. But I enjoy actually food, or I enjoy actual food, I should say.
But I suppose what you are all saying is that it is debatable whether this fuel is normal eating. But ultimately, an eating disorder is something that's causing distress and interfering with normal functioning of one's life in one area or many areas.
It's TULIP here. The other thing you've got to remember about eating disorders is that they are quite lethal conditions. Of all the mental health conditions that people suffer from, and this might surprise you, that the death rate is highest among people with eating disorders through, a combination of things. And binge eating, binge purge situations are actually quite dangerous medically, because people with those disorders often, as PAELLA said, look very normal, look even healthy, but they can cause quite severe electrolyte disturbances in their body that lead to things like heart attacks and all sorts of things. So these are very serious conditions. It's not just that they cause distress. People die from eating disorders, and so they have to be taken seriously. And I think the intervention has to come as early as possible as well, because once they become ingrained, then you do get physiological changes which are very difficult to reverse in things like appetite control, recognizing when you're full, which are all hormonally driven, and things get reset in the brain and have to be worked at to, get right again over a long period of time. So, there are physical changes as well as mental changes, which are difficult to reverse. These are serious conditions which have to be taken very seriously. And I know we're talking about people, being in recovery here, but in some ways, I think FERN's comments earlier about learning to live with an eating disorder, keeping it under control, understanding it better, not wanting to go to that terrible place that you were before, all these things help you to keep it under control and to understand it. And from what I've seen and learnt from Candle's experience and other people's experiences that I've, talked to other parents and so on, it's a bit like a lifelong condition which needs managing, and it comes and goes. And I think what Candle said about filling your life with things other than the eating disorder are really important, because it can kind of resurge and start, filling those cracks again quite easily. So, I think you have to take it seriously and be aware of it really for a long time. I don't know what you feel, you guys who've suffered from it.
Yeah, I look back and I just think, what happened to my 20s? I think that was all of my 20s were wasted with this preoccupation. And I would strongly urge anybody who's who's young, just to try and seek help now, immediately, and not from forums on the internet, because they are the most counterproductive thing that anybody with eating disorders can do. There's a lot of eating disorders forums where people are sharing their experiences, but it can be really quite competitive, and it can end up with people with eating disorders sharing their best tips and tricks to keep losing the weight and continuously encouraging each other to lose the weight as well. So definitely avoid those.
Yeah, I'm still in two minds as to whether it's a good idea to treat eating disorder patients all together on the same ward. because, on the one hand, they are able to empathise with each other and support each other, but on the other hand, they compete with each other to see who can gain weight the slowest, or to see who can avoid the most nutrition. And there's kind of symptom pooling going on, where one person will start suffering from a certain set of symptoms, and then they just get passed around as a kind of social disease. And there's this huge level of ambivalence involved in these things. And I certainly felt that ambivalence, because for the longest time I didn't want to recover. I liked it. I like being dangerously thin, and I liked the kind of delusional state that I was in, where my brain wasn't really working properly. There was a comfort to that madness. And I could only begin to recover when I decided that I wanted to, and that I was prepared to own those decisions. I don't know whether the fact that I was surrounded by people with whom there was less support, but also a degree of competitiveness, aided my decision in wanting to recover, or actually hindered it.
Okay, fascinating. We're approaching the end of the podcast, but I'd really like to thank everybody for their contributions. I've learnt so much. Thank you to Paella, and to my co-host Candle, and to Tulip. It seems this is such a long journey. I've heard it takes years for people suffering from an eating disorder to say, or own, or realise that they have an eating disorder, and then get to the point of seeking help and treatments. I hear from you that treatment's vital when the eating disorder has really progressed, but that it can be very, very hard, maybe not possible at all, to fully recover without getting that expert treatment. But I'm also hearing that time being hospitalised can be beneficial. I've heard that, but also that there's this risk, as you've just said, Candle, of a lot of people with different eating disorders together starting to influence each other, and sometimes that can be negative. So there's a balance. Also, hearing how involved the family or the support network around the sufferer of the eating disorder is, a lot of thought has to go into supporting your family member. And it sounds as though nobody can come out of the process untouched or unscathed. A lot of soul searching and reflection has to happen along the way. So I commend all family members and those suffering with eating disorders for all the hard work that goes into coming through this on this journey. You all sound like you're on the journey still, after several years, but you've all gained so much knowledge and self-awareness. And I can see how it could feel so worthwhile working with other sufferers on their journeys. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much. All. Just wanted to add, thank you all for your contributions. It's been really amazing. Should we do a one-word checkout? So just in one word, how are you feeling right now? And for me, I think I'm feeling more connected would be my one word. Connected. Feel free to unmute and just jump in and let us know how you're feeling. One word.
Hopeful.
Hopeful. It's great.
Enlightened.
Enlightened. And do just mention your nickname when you.
Sorry, Paella. Paella was hopeful.
Hopeful. And Oxygen was connected. Do you have one? Candle, Tulip?
It's Tulip, yeah, and I feel proud of the people who have taken part in this, and of the work and the thought and self-examination that's had to go into this, and the kind of steadfastness and understanding that they brought to themselves. I think it's, that's very good.
Definitely.
I think there's, sorry to keep going on, just one big point for me is actually there's a lot of importance in the fact that I was able to say that I'm eating dinner, because meals were not a thing for me. It was either starve or binge. And the fact that I've named myself Paella, I'm feeling very, very proud of myself. I know it sounds probably quite silly to some people, but this kind of thing is a big deal. So yeah, sorry, I'm just having
Definitely. Well done, Paella.
We're proud of you. We're really proud of you.
Thank you.
Proud of you, Paella. I didn't actually pick up on the Paella name thing, but yeah, that's really amazing. Thank you all for joining this Tally Talk, and please do remember to focus on self-care as usual. Go for a walk, have a drink of water, and just, use all the tools you can around you.
Thank you for listening to the Tally Talk podcast. Remember to subscribe to our channel and be the first to access our weekly episodes. If you would like to leave us a comment, then please email at hello@tallytalk.com. We would love to hear your thoughts and suggestions. For all other inquiries, please visit www.tallyapp.com. Thank you and see you next time.